Thank you, Charles. If anyone had told me that there'd be more than 6 people pitching up in London on a grisly morning to listen to the Sahel, I would have been amazed. So I'm more than amazed, and thank you all for coming. And I'm very surprised that the Sahel has drawn so much interest. On the other hand, I'm not, because it is a fascinating part of the world in terms of what's going on there. And I'm just going to see how this zapper works. And there we are. So from that sense, I'm not. When I brief the armed services, our armed services, on this same subject, they give me 4 hours. And at the end of 4 hours, we're still hammer and tongs and going at it and so on and so forth. So how I'm going to run through an extraordinarily complicated story in a short 40 minutes, I don't know. But so forgive me if I rush and skim over deep issues, but we can probably pick them up later. Okay, there we are. Is that the wrong way? Yes, it is. Okay, a map of the Sahel. It's I say an unknown part of the world. The word Sahel means shore, and it really means the shore of the Sahara. It's the Arabic word for shore. And it's really defined in ecological terms, so rainfall and vegetation and so forth. So you can draw a sort of wavy band across that part of Africa right out to Somalia, and that's all sort of Sahel, technically in an ecological sense. Politically, we refer to it now much more as a political entity, very much those 4 countries of Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and possibly Sudan. So when people now talk about the Sahel, they're usually meaning, the political sense of those 4 countries. I've put this other map up, which I'll intersperse all the way through, because it gives you a better idea, possibly, of the region. The key things to note there are the mountainous areas. They are strategically important, both politically and possibly in terms of minerals and so forth. Much of the Sahara is a very high mountainous area and going down into the Sahel. So I'll come back to this map on occasion. Okay, to introduce the Sahel, it means Arabic, shore in Arabic. The key points about it is incredibly complex ethnically. There are hundreds of ethnic groups there. Many of these, and this is an important fact, they transcend borders. So borders don't go around ethnic groups and so forth. So you've got some big ethnic groups, Pearl, Fulani, Hausa, Tuareg, that straddle many countries. And this is an important fact in terms of the fighting and the war that's going on there now. There are big cleavages traditionally amongst them, in particular black versus white. Black means black-skinned, white means white-skinned. In political terms, that means Arabic or Tuareg to the north. So that's a pretty nasty cleavage that goes across laterally. There's also a cleavage between pastoralists and agriculturalists. You might say nomads and farmers, which is complex, it's messy, and it straddles that same boundary, and that is also crucial to much of the fighting that's going on now. In terms of the history of the region, this is it has a hugely deep history, and people are aware of this. I won't go into detail now, we haven't got time, but the Manding Empire was massive. Mansa the king was tended to be estimated probably the richest man in the world. Forbes reckoned it was equivalent to about 400 billion now, and that was all gold. And you had this huge gold deposits. Timbuktu was a great centre of learning, 25,000 students there, a million manuscripts. These were massive. Gao itself, further along from Timbuktu, a huge international trade centre known in Europe, gold, slaves, and all sorts of other things. And of course the Ashanti Empire, which was a bit later. So this huge depth of history, which people are aware of, and that's important. Colonially, this was part of French West Africa, and the countries there. I should say that the colonial period here was pretty ruthless. Some horrendous atrocities took place. I haven't got time to go into them, but it made most of British imperialism look quite sort of rosy and nice. There's some pretty horrific things happened. A lot of these were buried, and they were literally only discovered in about 1970, I think by a PhD student in Bordeaux or somewhere that dug up a lot of the details on this, particularly that expedition at the top there, which was really a massacre of everybody, pretty well right across the whole region. They just killed every person they found. So the countries today of French West Africa, Mauritania, Senegal, French Sudan, which is now Mali, French Guinea, Côte d'Ivoire, Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, Dahomey, Benin, and Niger. The post-colonial era, which is now, more important for three reasons. One is the France-Afrique policy. We could talk about this forever, but basically it's a pretty corrupt policy between France and many of its French sort of former colonies. Bribery and corruption is at the essence of it. The sort of deal is we will look after your rulers, your dictators, and prop them up, etc. In exchange, we would like various sort of commissions on trade, etc., etc., etc. So France-Afrique is a pretty messy business, very important in the Sahel when we talk about bad governance and all this sort of stuff, which is at the root of this. Underneath that bad governance, France-Afrique policy is strong. It's also tied by a communal currency controlled by France. There's quite a lot of movement against this now to break away from the unified currency. So that is a common factor. It makes life economically very difficult if they're trading with other countries, by the way. So it does have negatives in the economic sense. And of course, the most important thing we'll come on to is, since 2012, the military intervention in the region. I just throw this map up occasionally because we might want to refer to it and remind you of it. Okay, the background to all this is again important, but we haven't got time to go into much detail. But the background really comes from the global war on terror and the Mali crisis. The global war on terror in the Sahel was launched into the region in about 2004. A lot of it, those of you who heard me talk before, I've talked about it a lot of it was fabricated. It was fabricated between the Americans and the Algerians, basically to justify having the war on terror there and having that sort of thing there. So this has caused a lot of trouble in the region. It's destroyed the tourist industry, it's destroyed much of the rest of the local economy and so forth. So much of the history of the crisis now goes back to that era. 2006, the GSPC, which was a local Algerian terrorist group, was changed its name into Al-Qaeda, and it was heavily infiltrated by the Algerian intelligence services. So they had a policy in Algeria of having more or less infiltrating the terrorist groups, to a sense almost controlling them, which they did to some extent, and being able to manage or manipulate much of the so-called terrorism in the region. And from about 2008-9, Algeria used this policy to its infiltration of these networks to push terrorists from Algeria south into the Sahel. And most of the Al-Qaeda groups now operating in that region were sort of pushed south, encouraged down there around that period of time. To get assistance from the Americans in the war on terror, a lot of the local governments tried to call people terrorists when they weren't, so they tended to provoke many of the local people, particularly the Tuareg, into taking up arms. So they provoked quite a lot of local rebellions and then said, well, these are terrorists. And of course, that is also part of the big problem that exists today. So much of the history of this is pretty murky in terms of those reasons. Another big impact, of course, has been the impact of Libya, the 2011 revolution and Gaddafi's overthrow. And this was really a very big sort of trigger on top of the bad news of the global war on terror. It led to many Tuareg cover much of the desert regions of the Sahel, returning to their countries, Mali and Niger, pretty disgruntled, pretty fed up with life for all the obvious reasons. And irredenticism and nationalism amongst Tuareg at that time was high, and they were talking about northern Mali as Azawad. Azawad is the Tuareg name for it, and the idea of creating an independent Tuareg state in that part of Mali, northern Mali, in other words. That in itself was a threat to Algeria. Algeria has a Tuareg population, and they felt if we get this going on south of the border, it could trigger trouble in Algeria. So Algeria moved rapidly and very cleverly, I think, really, to head this off. And through their DRS, that's the Secret Service, they created new Islamist groups. So a lot of these Islamist groups were created literally by the Algerian secret services, Moujao, Ansar al-Din. These are names which are operative in the region now. And then they, in 2012, sort of sent them down into northern Mali. So there was an Islamist incursion of so-called terrorists. supplied by Algeria, the fuels from Algeria, their food was by her. It was a huge operation, actually. And one reason why the DRS is now in trouble is because all this has come to light and so forth. So we're dealing with something that happened 6-7 years ago. The result of it was that the Islamists deliberately sort of rubbished the Tuareg rebellion, people call the MNLA group. So they were politically sidelined, military sidelined, to get rid of this irredentist threat. That worked very well from an Algerian point of view. But it got out of hand, and the Islamists more or less took over northern Mali, and all the problems you're aware of the destruction of Timbuktu, all that happened under their watch. The result of that was that the Tuareg, or this rebellion, began beginning of 2012. The Islamists took it over, the MNLA, that's the Tuareg, were weakened, and the northern Mali fell into the hands of, if you like, Islamists, and this is the so-called Mali crisis. It led to a coup in Mali and all sorts of problems there. I keep going back to the map just in case we want to keep looking at it, but I'll move on. So France moved in to the area 11th of January 2013 at the request of the Mali government, which felt that the Islamists might be just about to launch an attack on Bamako. We'll never know if that was true or not, but it was looking, a bit messy. And France moved in January, very effectively, you might say, militarily, with the usual heavy equipment, airstrikes and so on and so forth. And they killed off a lot of the so-called jihadists. They drove a lot of them out of the country, particularly to Libya, also up into Tunisia and elsewhere across the Sahel. But some remained. They just went back into the woodwork, so to speak, into the towns, and they are still there, and they're now part of the current problem. In 2014, 18 months later, they ramped up the French troops by another, numbers are a bit dodgy, at least sort of 4,000 now. There are probably about 5,000 French troops there. And Operation Barkhane, the French force, now straddles the whole of the Sahel region, Mali, Niger, and Chad. So it's a big operation. The UN also put in a peacekeeping force, MINUSMA. It says 14,000 here. I think, Tom, you probably updated that. Thanks. It's 13,000 and something or other of peacekeepers. And it's the world's deadliest peacekeeping operation. Nearly 200 have already been sort of killed off. It's 170 or 80. It's for a peacekeeping operation, it's pretty dangerous stuff. And of course, this is bringing pressure on France from the French public, the French media. And so France is trying to offload its military responsibility onto a local sort of force called the G5S, which is an army or force brought up from the 5 countries of the region. It's just not really working. People aren't funding it enough. Well, France's idea, let them fund it type of thing. It's beset with lots of problems, which you can imagine, of competition between the countries, lack of training of troops and so forth. So you've got the G5S, but really it's being left to France to sort things out. So the stakeholders in the region, huge numbers of them, a very, very complex region. Just to run through them, all the governments of the region, the countries, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso. The neighbouring states, of course, are affected by this, Senegal, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, particularly Algeria, and Libya as well, increasingly. The regional states in the area which have an interest, such as Morocco, for example, through the Western Sahara, and investments. The state security forces of those various countries, the armies, police, intelligence services, and so forth. As I mentioned, troops are about 30,000 troops. This is something, 30,000 troops in the Sahel. This is a huge figure, made up of roughly 5,000 French, UN 13,000, 14,000, they're peacekeepers, G5S about 5,000 plus contingents from lots of European countries and others, Western countries, helping out the UN, Germany, UK, Canada, who are withdrawing, by the way, Holland, Sweden, Italy, small numbers, but they all add up. And of course then the multinational organizations, the various UN agencies, World Bank, the EU, African Union, Bank of Africa and so forth. The non-state actors, who are probably more interesting or less obvious, of course the peoples of the region, because most of these countries are dictatorships, so people don't have much say in government, so the people in general. Businessmen in the areas, a lot of commerce and business, particularly drug traffickers. This is big business. I'll come on to this a lot. Massive business. Any of you here involved in drug trafficking, this is the place to be. This is where the money is. We're talking about billions, not millions, okay? And they are a problem. Foreign companies, not in the drugs business, well, as far as I know, oil, gas, mining companies, there are quite a few of those around, in spite of all the problems of the Sahel. Of course, all the multitude of NGOs, many there. A lot have been withdrawing recently because of the instability. Religious groups, the Islamic Council of Mali and so forth. ISIS, I suppose you could call a religious group, but it's not too prominent in the well, it is. The unrepresented nations and people. This is a UN organisation, Tuareg and the Tubu and the Western Sahara. We would probably include in that category. Then, of course, the sort of violent non-state actors, of which there are many, 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 many. I won't even go through them. In Mali, you've got at least 6 Tuareg groups or factions, one sort or another. You've got in central Mali alone at least 3 or 4 community defence militias. The killing is pretty rife at the moment. It's really nasty stuff. Pearl, Dogon, Bambara. You've got the Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam, which is the French call Jenim, which I think is rather nice, sounds much nicer, which is headed by Iyad Agrali, who is again a DRS agent, Algerian agent, who's been surviving since the 1980s. You've got ACME, Mujal, these are all the old sort of terrorist groups, if you want to call them that, all of which were pretty well infiltrated by the Algerian DRS of a few years back. You've got the Islamic State moved into the area in moderate, less, not so bigger numbers, calling itself the Islamic State in the Grand Sahara. You've got other local militias, Ganda-Koi, Ganda-Iso, and then you've got all the militia attached to the drug traffickers, which overlap with these. So it's a multitude of profusion of complexity, and of course they change their allegiances as day and night. In Niger, in the west, you've got Jenim, big problems. At least 52,000 people have had to be fled the region, western in Niger, in this last year. In the southeast, you've got Boko Haram coming in from Nigeria in quite a problematic sort of way. In Chad, you've got problems on literally every border, and in rebel groups in the north. Up in Tibesti, these are picking up currency at the moment, and there could be big problems in northern Chad in the next few months. It's been ramping up for the last couple of months there. Very complex situation. In the south, Central African Republic, problems on the border there, and of course Boko Haram coming into the Lake Chad region, and Sudan not terribly stable either. Burkina Faso, you've got jihadist groups in the north spreading east and west into neighbouring territories, and of course in Nigeria, Boko Haram is having a second or third lease of life in the north. So if we go back to that map, there's pretty well everywhere is covered by instability of one sort or another. The current situation, well, most of the region's problems are caused by underdevelopment and particularly bad governance. But you're into this vicious sort of conundrum, really. You can't really have development without security. So this whole question of the chicken and egg, or the cart before the horse, of do we try and get stability and security before we can move into development and so forth, and this is quite a problem that's going on now. My view on that is the military solution is not the answer. Okay, sure, it's knocking out a lot of jihadist leaders, but also the killing of civilians is far higher. These are mostly inter-community fightings that have been caused by this, each group is saying the other groups are terrorists and la-di-da-di-da. It's getting really sort of messy, and the answer to that is not found in the military, as France is finding out, and one or two other Western powers who are involved there is there. So the military ramps up its successes. We killed off this X, Y, and Z this week, but it's not, you kill off one, 2 more grow up in its place. It's a bit of that sort of problem. And of course it makes the local population more and more anti the Western presence, the French presence and so forth. So it's not the answer, but there isn't a ready-made alternative answer to take over yet, except somewhere along the line they're going to have to talk to all these people. That is more complicated for reasons I'll come on to in a moment. The situation has deteriorated progressively from about 2013 onwards. So if we talk about this long war, as it's now been called, or the Sahel war, I think it's really been going downhill a bit, from 2013. How do we measure that? Well, probably deaths and killings. These are the simplest way of measuring this insecurity and so forth. Increased inter-community violence. This is really messy now, particularly in Mali. 100, 200 people a month are being killed. The statistics are difficult to get. The jihadist expansion into central Mali, into Niger, into Burkina Faso, threatening the countries around it. The Fezzan region of southern Libya is deteriorating and threatening Niger's security. This is ISIS groups, mostly in Libya, being pushed south, and southern Libya becoming a bit more unstable as a result of that and coming over the border. In Chad, you've got rebellions breaking out in the north, in the Tibesti regions, which have only been going for a couple of months. They could get worse. I think they might. In Burkina Faso, the whole government resigned this last week, stood down because of increased instability and so forth. In Mali, there's increased political instability, caused not least by the re-election of the president in 2018, more corruption, more bad governance and so forth, and more civil protests against that. So pretty well across the region, the current situation is all heading south in terms of those sort of trends. Okay, where does the region go from there? Well, all the multilateral and bilateral initiatives, UN, African Union, EU, G5S, ECOWAS, they're not really going anywhere at all because no one is really very clear where to go. There's also divisions between them, and a lot's being left to bilateral deals. So there's quite a lot of individual initiatives coming in from France, Morocco, China in a big way. Russia's fiddling around in the area. Turkey is trying to get in. Saudi Arabia is making noises. Israel put its foot in the water this last week or two with disastrous consequences. I won't talk about it now, but you might want to raise that. The killing of the UN troops last week, I think, was meant to be an attack, a message to Israel. But that's something we can't have time for now. But basically, everyone's leaving it to France. The Sahel is out of the way. We don't really want to get involved. It's a lot of money. It's very complex. France is there. It's their problem. That is, I think, the international sentiment. People won't admit to that, but that's really what's going on. There is more support from Europe, but Europe's interest is mostly in controlling migrancy. So much of the European aid assistance is more geared to trying to stop migrants crossing the Sahara and coming into Europe than anything else. So self-interest from Europe. The Trump administration, by and large, is opposed to giving any more help to the UN. It doesn't want to help the G5S. Whatever it's going to do is going to be on a bilateral basis. And most of its plans are to withdraw troops, that's boots on the ground, out of the region. That is going to lead to more drone warfare, so replacing boots on the ground with drones, armed drones, that's France and the US. At the moment, the US has drone bases in Niamey, Derkou, and Agadez, the big, huge base at Agadez, the biggest one being built in the world. This is leading to potential problems of collateral strikes. There's a lot of fear that these drones will do that. And last month, there was an attack in Libya which hit the wrong people. So there's quite a lot of worry locally about drones, which may have all their efficiencies, about the sort of collateral damage. The most interesting thing about the area, I think maybe the most important, is the region really is becoming a narco-terrorist state. And this is quite interesting. I won't talk too long on it. I could talk for ages. It's very interesting. In a sense, Algeria is playing a key role in this, and that's really turning this region deliberately into a very rich, money-making, narco-terrorist sort of place. Algeria has always played a double game. It's at the forefront of all anti-terrorist moves, at the UN level, international level, supporting America, but at the same time, it also supports terrorism. It's also as I've described earlier. For example, the global war on terror in the region, most of that was false flag operations, mostly handled by Algeria on behalf of other interests most of the time. The Menas attack, a lot of you will remember, that was a false flag operation that just went disastrously wrong. It was engineered by the DRS and it ended up in tragic circumstances. And again, this infiltration of the DRS into the various terrorist groups over a long period of time. And in a sense, the key jihadist leader in the region, this man Iyad Agrali, is protected and supplied by Algeria, and he has been for a very long time. The most interesting thing about this, I mean, for me anyhow, is this group called Tashliks. And you'll never hear this word again, I doubt, apart from if you're reading anything I've written. These are the key players in this narco-terrorist state. They're mostly Arabs from the Sahel, and they're based mostly in Tamanrasset, which is the big city at the bottom of Algeria. The word Tashlik is a derivative, it's a Tamashek Tuareg word, and it comes from Tashleg Ekahe, which literally means carrying one's trousers on one's shoulder, over the shoulder. So you take your trousers off, chuck them over your shoulder. And the background for that is that, particularly in Mauritania, the Moors used to wear traditionally very, very big gandura and lots of very expensive material in them to show off their wealth and their lovely materials. But to save the pantaloons, the trousers wearing out when you're riding on a camel, they would take their trousers off, they're wearing gandura, chuck them over their shoulders, but then when they met people, they came to a camp, they'd stop, get dressed again and look all neat and dandy. Well, for the Tuareg, they used to ridicule this, and hence the term, the people who wear their trousers over their shoulders. But it's become a very derogatory term for Arabs in the Sahel region. These are the Berbice tribes, the Lamar tribe, the Kunta tribes, the Tassar, the Tuareg, the Arab tribes in the Sahel regions, Timbuktu, Gao, these sort of places, who are mostly commercial people, commerçants, who've moved into drug trafficking in a big way. With their money, they've bought into Tamanrasset, they bought Algerian citizenship, they control much of the trade in southern Algeria, they bribe all the very bribable people in Algeria, the army, the politicians. So they've become a major force in southern Algeria, mostly a criminal sort of force. There's huge money involved here. The Algerian army, which is very corrupt, goes along with this, gives them protection over the border and so on and so forth. And this is becoming probably the major driver of the troubles going on, particularly in Mali and so forth. So we talk about jihadism, which is there, but underneath this, there is this huge narco-terrorist business. Almost everyone is involved with it. The scale is huge. And this is probably where the real problem comes. So we're shifting now, if you like, from terrorism, jihadism, into something, we can probably understand a bit better in a tangible way. So many of the people, because the local economy has been destroyed, are moving into this. They've got nothing else to do. People don't die easily. They find alternative ways of surviving. So they're getting drawn into this, more and more militia, etc. So these networks of armed groups, they're supplying arms. I think most of the arms are coming down south from Algeria. Algeria claims this is arms coming north, but it's a bit messy to know that. Because this sort of business, it requires instability to survive. If you want to run drugs, you need instability, you need weak government. You don't want the French army breathing down your neck, you don't want the UN there or any other Western power. Hence the attacks very much on the soft targets. They can't get at the French troops, a bit difficult to kill, they're well protected and they're efficient, but the UNs are sitting ducks. So hence, the attacks are geared to really get the West out of the area. We want this instability because it's good business, particularly for Algeria, which historically, as I've explained, has all these networks and routes into the area. Does anyone want to comment on the map while it's there? I'm really looking at Mali at the moment for the Tashlik problem. On the left, you can see this is the left diagonal. That whole frontier area there is becoming hugely unstable, and this is where much of this Tashlik business is going on. Okay, that's the bad news. The future opportunities for economic development and investment and so forth. I suppose I start with gold, only because gold is, to me, the most interesting. Oil and gas are probably much bigger. And particularly the illicit mining of gold. The region is full of gold. Qaita, Mansa, Mansa Kaita was the richest man in the world. The region has still got today some of the biggest, most profitable gold mines in the world. But the region is awash with gold. You can, on that map, you can literally go right across from left to right, and there's just gold all over the place. Most of it not commercially viable, most of it surface, quartz-bearing stuff. So local people can hack into it, get it out, and it's pretty dangerous stuff. Some of them are sending down shafts 300 or 400 feet deep, you know, like digging a well. Going down there's a death every week. And to give you some idea, there are about 100,000 people involved in artisanal, clandestine, illicit gold mining across the region. It's huge. And this has really been going on really since about 2014. These gold rushes started. There have been gold rushes. I just mentioned the places in Mauritania, Kidal, northern Mali, Asamaka, that's just south of the Algerian border in Niger, Chibarakatan. There are 34,000 people alone this year at Chibarakatan. You can't even find it on a map. It's right close on the Algerian-Niger border. Ahagar in southern Algeria, these are controlled mostly by the army, rather corrupt, they're taking over the business there. Jado Plateau up in Niger, across into Tibesti, and much of the present fighting I mentioned about in Tibesti is linked to the discovery of gold in the Miska region there. The official figures, for what they're worth, reckon about 50 tons a year of gold is being produced just in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. If you add in Chad, Mauritania, you may be up to about 85 tons a year. That is what is coming out from local people, you and me, panning away, dying, going in these appalling conditions, but it's on a huge scale. Commercially, things are rather different. There is massive gold in the region, further south. Most of the gold panning is up in the desert areas, in those mountainous areas or near to them. In Mali, for example, it's the third ranking country in Africa in terms of gold production. I think, from my count, there are about 13 sort of, I call them Western companies working there. Maybe a tad less now, but it's about that. And Mali alone is producing, its production's dropped down a bit for the last few years, but it's going to pick up again. At the moment, it's about 45 tons a year. That's probably conservative. It may be a bit more than that. Some of the big mines, Sadiola Mine, Anglo Gold, Ashanti Group, and IM Gold, a local group. The Sayama mine, run by the Australian company Resolute Mining, they issued a statement only a week or so ago saying this is basically the most efficient, profitable, advanced mine in Africa. So we're dealing with really high-tech, advanced commercial gold mining alongside this extraordinary sort of artisanal mining, which is, along with drug trafficking and all this, is keeping the local population survived. Mauritania, big gold deposits, the Tassias mine, Kinross up in the northeast. There's one or two other licenses up there as well. Niger, Samara Hill is now taken over by the Niger state, right up close to the Burkina Faso border. And Burkina Faso itself is the fourth largest producer in Africa. So gold mining is big and is on the up, I think, developing. We're looking sort of towards the future. Other investment opportunities in the region, oil and gas, obviously. Mauritania has huge offshore deposits. The Tortue field, which means turtle, which is split between Senegal and Mauritania, offshore there, has got sort of 30 years of massive gas supplies. BP is the main operator there. Cosmos is a partner. I don't know if BP people are here today, but that is really an exciting, huge field. I haven't got the map there, but literally offshore there, which will have big impact on the local economies. I think they have only about 10% of it, but nevertheless, it will have a big impact in transforming, in terms of energy, the local economies, Senegal and Mauritania. Further north in Mauritania, there's also offshore deposits. Total are there, half a dozen companies are operating there. So the offshore potential around the bend of Africa, or the bulge of Africa, there is huge. A little bit onshore as well, but I think it's much less. Total are I say, fiddling around in Taoudani inside Mauritania. I was talking to them many years ago, and I said, is there much there? And they said, well, between you and the gatepost, it's all a bit fragmented, but who knows, we keep a presence and so forth. So I don't think there are going to be huge strikes on the internal side of Mauritania, but you never know, a lot of it's unexplored, but offshore, massive. Niger is really exciting. Niger only became a producer in 2011, an oil producer, in the Agadem block, which is down in the south east, where Exxon began developing it there, then they sold out, the CMC China took over, and now Savannah Petroleum, which is a British company, very exciting little company. I don't know if anyone's from Savannah here today. I write the monthly reports on this area, and about the only good news for the last half a dozen months, after all this downside, is Savannah's just sunk another well and hit good stuff. So I think they've sunk 5 wells in the Agadem block in the last half dozen months, all very positive, and this is leading Niger to becoming a significant little oil state. They reckon they can increase production, oil production, to about 110,000 barrels a day from about 20 or whatever it is now. So it will become an exporter. They've got a refinery there. They're talking about a pipeline being built down to Benin. At the moment, it's going out into Chad, then down the Chad pipeline into the Atlantic at Kribi. So Niger is a place to watch. There's also another block up in the north of Niger, up on the Algerian border, the Kafra block, which Sonatrach are exploring. I think the results there, a bit early in days, are looking okay, positive, but they're still a little way off sort of production there. So Niger is becoming significant as an oil producer. And of course that releases money for export. I'll come on to this in a moment. Of course, also they're replacing a lot of energy with solar. Solar energy in Niger is looking very positive and very exciting. Chad oil production, okay, that's been around about 130 barrels a day at the moment. Quite significant. It keeps a totally bankrupt country a little bit afloat. Companies there, ExxonMobil, there's a whole string of them are there, and that also is looking a bit more positive as well, in spite of the political uncertainty of Chad itself. Other minerals and potential in the region, there's an awful lot actually. I've just stripped these down to notes here, but those of you in the mining sector will know or heard of the potential in the Sahel region. In Mali, there's diamonds, you've got a lot of gemstones, quite big deposits of phosphates. I think they're frozen at the moment. They're up in the place called the Tlemcen Valley, which is right where some of the worst sort of fighting is going on. I think they're sort of mothballed just for the moment. They've been there, have been there for a long time, and the government has been making efforts, chatting to guys like you, come and help us get this stuff out. And they're saying, well, it's a bit different, maybe next year if it's more stable. So I think, phosphates in that area is earmarked for big developments. Bauxite mines, iron ore, there manganese, there's bits of everything. They're huge resources. Most of these at the moment are really being mothballed. They're not, because of the security situation. Mauritania, of course, has some of the biggest iron ore deposits in the world, being appallingly badly managed by what still is a fairly corrupt government, bad management, but they've got, and the world price of course has dropped over the last 4 or 5 years, but huge iron ore deposits up in the north. 38. We'll figure I've got 38% of exports a year ago. It was just iron ore. They've got copper as well. 1 or 2 other mines. A lot of Mauritania, frankly, is not that well explored. Niger, 4th largest uranium deposits in the world. Well, the uranium market's going south, but there's still a need for it, and there are other companies moving in there. So huge production of uranium in Niger. Chinese companies there, several international companies. Areva, now called Orano, was the big one there, but Japanese companies moving in South Korea and so forth, Spanish companies. So, and there's new coal mining going on. It's kind of interesting. Coal's dead, but it's a local development. I haven't mentioned it there. So there's on the mining side alone, there is huge potential right across the Sahel. And again, I keep returning to the map. So, in spite of this area being a colossal tragedy and bit of a nightmare region, really. There's positive food for thought, I think, and particularly from the corporate end of the world. The first thing, and the most obvious thing, is we talk about security and insecurity. If you think about it, oil and mining is kind of oblivious and immune from these sort of issues. You can ring fence yourselves. If you're in the middle of a desert, and whether it be Algeria or Libya, well, Libya's a bit different. Basically, you ring fence yourself. You fly stuff in, you fly stuff out. And these things pass you by, and I don't know, Savannah oil people are here. They might like to comment on that. They're in operating in Niger, other companies too. You are relatively safe, from these things. They're well guarded, well defended, and they're not really the obvious targets of so-called jihadists. They would rather hit local government, they'd rather hit UN peacekeepers for the reasons I've mentioned. If they could knock out a few French, well, that's gold dust. They're not going to really sort of, go after oil companies. And the other thing too, if we move it up a scale to alternative governments, we might take Algeria as an example. A lot of people ask me this. Whoever's ruling the country, they're still going to need the oil and the gas and the mines. They need revenue. So by and large, governments may come and go, but apart from odd places like Venezuela, things remain the same. So I mentioned this, it's a statement of the obvious, really. We talk about all the insecurity, but in the oil and gas, hydrocarbon sector and mining fields, in a sense, you're a little bit detached from those problems. As I've said, many of the projects, particularly mining, an awful lot of infrastructural projects too, bridges, dams, railway stuff. There's a lot of big infrastructural stuff that's been on the drawing boards for years. It's on hold because of the security situation. They are a bit more dangerous. You can't sort of build in the open. So a lot of plans, if you like, are on the drawing board. There's a lot of money available from international sources. The world internationally would love to pump money into developing this area because it is the poorest region of the world. Mali and Niger are the two, I think, usually the bottom two ranked countries in terms of poverty, etc. So there is a huge international goodwill to the development of these regions. They would probably like to see some of the governments change, get rid of the corruption, all the backhanders, but that's by the way. So I think this is very positive because there are huge projects there. China's taking advantage of them. Other countries are. Turkey's sniffing around. Morocco has got one or two investments there. Israel, a rather different thing altogether. That's going to cause problems. But other countries are looking at this. Turkey in particular is taking an interest in the region. Again, I can see tears down the line there probably. Russia's showing an interest. I was talking to a Russian expert only the other day. I said, what on earth is Russia doing there? And they said, well, they haven't got a clue. I said, well, why are they there? And they said, well, they just go wherever the Americans are. They just follow the Americans to see what they're doing. I won't insult Russia any more than that. And I don't know if the Americans know what they're doing either, but never mind. Russia's sniffing around. Much more positive on the American side is America has been aware since the global war on terror started in the region, then it was to really access oil. The world's changed. They're now very aware of the encroachment of China in particular into this part of the world, and America's been standing still, basically. And the International Development Finance Corporation, which is legislation is going through in the moment, I think, in the States, to provide $60 billion to counter China's overseas influence abroad. Most of that, I suspect, will be directed in the Asian areas, but Africa is ramping up, and more interest is being shown in America to counter Chinese interests there in terms of investment in the region. And again, whereas some of the Chinese investment are lost leaders, build a railway here, build something there, I think the American moves, when they come, which could be relatively soon, will be much more targeted, sensible projects, profitable projects, and so forth. And even if only half that money or a third of it goes into the region, there's a lot of potential development there. Again, the legislation's still got to go through, and the security situation probably has to improve a bit. Solar energy in the region too is picking up huge potential, of course, obviously the whole region because of the amount of sun. But Niger opened its first solar power plant a few weeks ago, and there are at least half a dozen new big ones, in the pipeline for next year, the year after, around most of the main towns, Maradi, Zinda, and so forth, Niamey. So again, all the business that comes out of that and so forth, again, is all looking very positive. So in spite of this region probably being, in many ways, certainly the most tragic, and I say it's tragic because 15 years ago, you could walk literally right across that region from one side to the other. You would be utterly, totally safe. You might tread on a snake, which might not do you any good. You might fall down a well if you're daft or drunk or anything else. But by and large, you would not be attacked by any people at all. It was safe. You'd be welcomed everywhere. It was one of the most fabulous places in the world, which is why the tourist industry was so big right through this region. That's gone for Burton, obviously, huge damage. And this is why it's such a tragedy, because the people who are doing all the killing are really the innocent parties to this global war on terror, which was dumped into the region under false pretenses, then all that's led to the collapse of Libya and the Mali crisis. In a sense, they're innocent bystanders. They've been drawn into this, and now they're mostly engaged in dodgy business just to survive. So I don't know how long I've taken there, Charles, but that's a very rushed tour of the Sahel. And if anyone would like to raise questions or make suggestions, I don't know if anyone from the companies I referred to are here perhaps, but please do.
Meanwhile, please join me in thanking Jeremy.